Now, Michael O'Doherty is a pioneer in the field of healthcare and a best-selling author with many years' experience in guiding many people back to health. Now, he believes the time has come for change and family healthcare needs to become the centre of focus. And I'm delighted to say that Michael joins me in studio. Good morning to you, Michael.
Good morning. How are you?
Founder, of course, of Bioenergy Healing as well. You've been writing quite a bit about social media addiction as you see it, Michael.
Yeah. It is a problem, for sure. And, what I see in my clinic every day, Fran, is that frustrated parents and indeed children trying to deal, I suppose, with the bigger issue. I mean, we see social media as a platform, I believe now, that's being used to help people cope with the stresses and the anxieties. And when we look at the figures in respect of the refusal or the absenteeism of children at school, or indeed adults at work, it is all backed to anxiety. And I believe that a lot of the children today who are hooked on social media platforms are hooked on it because of the bigger picture, which is the anxiety and stress. And every day in my clinic, that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing parents who are frustrated, the children who are frustrated, with, I suppose, the way society is, with the way that they feel, and in some way they're not being emotionally nourished, or not being that the real cause of this problem isn't being dealt with. And I think there's a big need for a big discussion around the emotional nurturing of our children.
And is it a case that the social media then is a distraction from reality in some way? Is that?
Well, it is. It is that. I mean, when you think about it today, Fran, that if you look at the figures of pre-COVID, up to 60,000 children a day are absent from school. Now, that doesn't take into consideration what's happened since COVID. So I'm sure the absenteeism, or what we are now calling refusal to attend school, is huge. And what's happening is that when children are not being listened to, or when their emotional needs are not being are addressed properly. Because children are young, as you can appreciate, they're learning. And in order for the brain to develop as a child, they need to be emotionally connected to and nourished. And what happens is with children, and particularly in modern society, I believe, is that the children are opting out because they don't know how to express themselves. And every day there are family homes that are being, exposed to stresses and anxieties in children, and parents and grandparents can't seem to deal with these types of problems. And what's happening is with these children then, they are in a way opting out, and they're getting onto platforms and identifying with people with similar problems, and often young people. And I think there's this absolute, abandonment of the nourishment that these children need. That's the bigger picture we've got to focus on.
And the result of this, Michael, will be what, do you think? Because, this is the first generation that will have grown up with all of this, I suppose. The result will be what?
Well, you see, one of the key things is that if we don't address the problem now, if somebody was on alcohol every day, for the amount of time that someone would spend on a social media platform, we would say they're alcoholics and they have an addiction. If somebody was smoking all day long, we would say they have an addiction. If somebody's on social media all day, and when parents come to me with their children who are stressed and anxious, and the thought process of these children changes, because when they feel they're not being listened to, when they feel their emotional needs are not being dealt with, then what happens is that the thought process changes. Now, often the thought process can be suicidal thoughts. And then what happens is that there is this, we're medicalizing the whole problem then. So obviously the parents are going to take their children to the doctor, and the doctor is going to refer them either to CAMS or to some psychological support. And there's this tendency to medicalize the problem. And we're medicalizing a problem that we can't diagnose. There's no blood test to determine a child has a psychotic problem, and indeed it doesn't. So what happens is there's this so when we get into the field then of medicalizing an emotional problem, what happens then is that sometimes medicine is prescribed where it's needed, but then we're heading down a slippery slope. So suddenly now we're moving from the children are not being emotionally nourished for a number of different reasons, which we can chat about, not emotionally nourished. They're opting out in a way of society. They're tuning into a social media platform as a coping mechanism. And when they're tuned into that coping mechanism, then they're detaching further from the environment of their home. And then suddenly, depending on what they're tuning into determines their thought process. Then their thought process becomes negative. And now we're going to medicalize it, and we're going further away from the cause of the problem. So down the road, what's going to happen to a bigger picture? Possible more addiction to substances, addiction to drugs. And of course, we know now in many schools, probably in all schools, children are under huge pressure, to conform to certain things or standards or groups that's happening in school. So the pressure that children are under nowadays is absolutely horrendous.
Huge. The pressure that parents are under as well has to be taken into account here, I suppose, Michael, because, it's almost impossible to pay a mortgage now without two people working. So you have two people out of the house quite a lot. You may have childminders involved, all of that kind of thing as well. Does that play into this?
Absolutely. And this is when I post often that, people are addicted to social media. It's not just children, adults as well.
Absolutely.
And it goes back to the human development, that we need to understand human development. We need to understand the importance of creating an environment that's nourishing, that's caring, that's compassionate, that's loving. That doesn't mean that parents aren't loving or compassionate, but I want, if we have to imagine, like you say, two parents getting up this morning, they have babies or they have young children. They're putting them into a creche or Montessori or whatever the case may be. They're going to work. They're coming home from work because they have to. They're coming home from work late, stressed. They come into an environment, the child is stressed, and that's ends meet, and the child is in bed, and suddenly, there's this disconnect. Now, we're all products of our environment. Our genes don't determine any of this. So we're all products of our environment. So when society, like you say, forces people into this sort of space where people have to work, to make ends meet, to pay for a mortgage, then there is a consequence. And for parents listening, we need to try and figure out some way of trying to cope with that. So there are consequences. And we do know that science has clearly established that, there are ways of trying to create a safe space. And when you talk about, excuse me, when I deal with some children and parents in my clinic, and, I really come back to the nuts and bolts of the problem. And, when I say, well, why don't you want to attend school? Why are you opting out? Why don't you want to attend work? Why are you absent from work if it's an adult? There's always this element of threat. There's always this element of fear. Because of the environment at school, because of the pressure and stress of the environment at school, the pressure and stresses environment at work, and whether it be bullying, whether it be pressure to be part of a group, whether you're ostracized from a group, and then you see when you go on social media platforms, you have to have a certain look, you have to wear certain clothes. So we're not valued. Children don't seem to be valued in the way that they should be valued.
And what about that? Because we touched on that earlier on the programme in a kind of a jovial sort of way, but of course it has a very serious side to it as well, in terms of how we look when we're on social media as well, and the stresses and the strains about that, particularly with young women. They have to look perfect.
Well, that's it. I often say that, our parents will often say to me, well, look, at my child is on social media. And I say, well, look, it is because it's trying to cope with the stresses and anxieties that it's experiencing. And the thing is that, at the same time, it's okay for women or indeed men to be on social media platforms looking at their, whoever they're following to see what kind of bag they have or clothes they have or boots they have or whatever the case may be. And that's the whole thing. There is this need for us to sort of connect with something, because the reason being is very simple. We lack the space to communicate. Now, if people listening to this at home could create the space to communicate We've lost the art of communication, but creating the space to communicate. And if we could create the space to communicate with children, with each other, then we would have probably less breakdowns, less addiction, less time.
And explain that to me. Are you talking about the family meal? Are you talking about the family conversation?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This is missing. This is missing because, like you say, people are coming home tired, and maybe they're trying to tie in maybe gym stuff going on. But when you take children specifically, and from a developmental perspective, because this is the fundamental thing, that the emotional nourishment helps the child to grow. Until our mid-20s, our brain hasn't developed fully. So you can take 10, 12, 13, 14-year-old child, or even younger, maybe 3 or 4-year-old child that has gone through some sort of trauma or stress, that is not able to express itself, but now develops a behavior. Okay, so what's actually happening? Well, the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex of the brain, has a number of different functions, but the vast majority of these functions are benefit from nurturing, from the right type of nurturing. So what we're seeing today in children, particularly when I see parents coming to me where their child is hyperactive or is aggressive or frustrated or whatever, what I find is that, and what people need to understand, these are not bold children. These are children who are acting out. And they're acting out, Fran, because they lack the words to express how they're feeling. So what we're doing is we're trying to deal with behavior. We're trying to medicalize behavior. We're trying to put a term on behavior. And it's like we're trying to control behavior. And whether that be through medication or whatever the case may be, but, we're trying to control behavior. Maybe just giving a child a phone, maybe trying to control the behavior. When in actual fact, what's happening is children are crying out inside for that love.
Engagement.
Yeah. You've got it. You're 100% right. And that's why creating the space at home for people. Imagine if people tonight decided, you know what, we're going to turn off the television, we're going to turn away off the phones, we're going to put them away, we're going to take down a jigsaw. We're going to take down a game of cards. There
would be war, Michael.
Fine, there would be war.
Yes.
But there's only war until such time as parents create some sort of space and educate children about the value of this space. Because I would say the war would probably come more from the parents, because we're so sort of caught up in this idea, well, should just give them this and they'll be fine. But I think children would adapt to it quicker. This is what I have seen in my clinic, that when we talk to parents and they understand this, and they try to find time, that sitting down playing, it might be putting Lego together.
Yes.
But the whole idea is stimulating the emotional aspect of the child.
I presume, Michael, that if you set up the discipline of that space and time early, it becomes the norm then.
And I have a thing about the word discipline.
Yes.
Because discipline has a negative connotation.
Yes.
Discipline means that, well, certainly for me growing up, if I had to be disciplined, and I'm sure I had to be disciplined many a times, it had the right reasons. But I think that we need to, it's more to have the discipline as a family to create the space to connect, to communicate, and to provide that nourishment, not just for the children, but also for ourselves, because it is this lack of connection that is causing children to act out and then to opt out. And when they opt out onto social media platforms where they connect with other children. And if other children are thinking the same way and thinking negative and thinking maybe suicide or whatever the case may be, what type of society are we creating?
How dangerous is that? Can I drag you in on one of the big topics of the week, which came from a letter to our agony aunt, Phil Prendergast, and it was about discipline. And it was about a mother-in-law who took serious issues with how her daughter-in-law was disciplining her children. She said the kids were like wild animals, was her words, and their behaviour was unfortunate, as again her words. And she spoke about where the 4-year-old spat at the mother, and the mother was, saying in a nice voice, you shouldn't do that, where she felt it should have been something more strong by way of discipline. Disciplining kids and teaching them respect and stuff without it becoming the wooden spoon. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a classic example of a child needing to be heard. When a child acts out by spitting or kicking or, pulling things up, pulling things down off tables or chairs or being very frustrated, it's important for the person who wrote this, the grandparent or whatever. It's important for them to understand that this is not normal. It's not a normal behaviour, but we don't discipline the behaviour, like I'm saying.
Oh, right.
Let's look at the reason why this child is like this. This child wasn't born like that. Now, look, we could get into the whole concept of the womb life of that child. Was the mother stressed? That impacts on the development of the child. There's the whole area from 0 to 9 months. There's huge research around that. And I mean, I see that in my clinics. We don't know whether that child was born through stress, C-section, vacuum, forceps delivery. So we're seeing at the early stage development of that child that the building blocks, that if you and I decide to sit down and build a house, that if we leave blocks out, well then there's going to be a weakness somewhere. So when children are in the womb, as it's building itself, the heart first in the brain, as the building blocks are happening, and then if there's any little flaw or stress, so every bit of stress the mother goes through, if she has to rush out to work, if she's stressed at work, if she's been bullied at work, if there's emotional stress, if there's a single parent, all of this plays into the foundation. And when we see cracks appearing there afterwards in a young child, we've got to go back and look at the foundation. And realistically, where there was no genetic problem, now we're looking at environment, because environment, genetics are the loaded gun. Environment is what pulls the trigger. So if the environment at home, because of parents out working and all of that kind of stuff, reared in a different environment, if the environment at home is wrong, children are going to act out. They're going to dramatize their trauma because it's traumatic. So when a child is behaving like this, I want the person who wrote this to understand there's a reason for that behavior. Don't discipline the behavior. We need to sit down with the child, understand what the child is trying to say. And when children don't have the language or the words to express how they feel, like I said earlier, how else are they going to communicate? So can you imagine if you let's say we arrive in Russia today. They can't speak English and we can't speak Russian. How are we going to communicate?
Yes.
So behavior is a means of communication. The message is trying to communicate is what we need to listen to. So can that child be fully saved, recovered, whatever you want to call it? Absolutely. We just need the parents, the grandparents. And it's absolutely fantastic that grandparents are there, because I think this is the bigger picture, that the family unit has shifted over the last number of years. When I grew up, you grew up, Fran, we had our grandparents, we didn't have social media, and the wisdom that grandparents brought into the family unit was huge when children came to them in these circumstances. But parents didn't have to rush out to work. So the nourishment and the caring and the love was there.
Well, you're right, because a large part of that communication with us was that the grandmother was being asked to look after these kids for a couple of days a week, but as she saw it, they were unruly. She couldn't manage them because of the way they were being disciplined, and that was the big issue. But there are demands on the grandparents now, because the parents can't afford childcare.
And now you take a single mother who doesn't have grandparents.
Absolutely.
I mean,
absolutely.
But I genuinely think when you take the science and the research behind this, and there are some great physicians out there who understand, who have written about this in great depth, the real crux of this is communication, nourishment. Getting in helping to create the environment so that children and adults develop. I mean, a lot of adults, why is there so much breakup in family or in relationships? A lot of it is because they don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to nourish, because we have disconnected and we have opted out of society, because society is so pressurized and is putting so much pressure. You take the academic environment, unless you're wearing the right clothes, you say, unless you're getting your 600 points in the leave, and now you're a failure. Yeah. So we have set the values too high, at a huge consequence to the emotional and mental health of children.
And is the genie out of the bottle, Michael? Is there healing?
There is healing.
Is there?
Absolutely. And I see it myself every day in my own clinic, and I know there are lots of others who deal with this in their own clinics. And I see it with children who change when you sit them down and you explain why they feel the way they feel. I had a young girl in my clinic recently. She was only 13, and she was stressed, came from an amazing background. You'd say the perfect background, all the love and caring, but her birth was traumatic, her womb life had been traumatic. And when I explained, look, this is the reason why, and parents understood it and the child understood it, and then we worked with the energy to release the stress, and then we supported that with right nutrition, and we created a safe space for the child, because children, you see, feel pressurized going to school if there's some bullying going on, if they're not adhering to the group philosophy. And, children are under pressure to take drugs in schools today. I'm talking about 12, 13, 14 years of age. I hear this from parents.
It's incredible.
So children are under pressure to take drugs. And some children are very strong because they come from solid backgrounds and they refuse. But now there's a consequence to that. So children are refusing to go to school because of that fear. And remember, when we remove fear from children's lives and from our own life, we feel safe. And we need to create a safe space to communicate, to connect, to emotionally nourish. And that's why meditation, right food, energy work, communication. So we do need to go back to correct. The healing begins at the home, Fran.
Has your practice changed dramatically over the years? Like when you and I first met, children wouldn't have been as prevalent in terms of coming to see you, would they?
Like when you think about it, I could reel out statistic after statistic here, friend, in the context of the huge increase in antidepressants, in prescription of antidepressants and antidepressants
to children.
To children, okay? And now the real consequences of that we don't know, because we're trying to medicalize something that needs human nourishing.
Yes.
Do you get what I'm saying? And it's fine, and I get it. I mean, I work with very good psychiatrists and psychologists, and for some I have to refer them there because some children are actually in the wrong zone. And parents then are really struggling, and there's huge fear in parents, no matter what the situation is. So I am urging people who are listening to this, where your child is behaving in what would be deemed an unsavory way, to not look at the behavior, but to look deeper at the message and the emotional connection that's needed to create that safe space at home, to create that space where you can communicate and work with each other. We can solve a lot of problems in that environment.
If people want to make contact with you, Michael, and see what it is you do, how can they do so?
Yeah, my own website is www.michaelodoherty.com. And people can contact me at my office as well. info@michaelodoherty.com is my email. And I'll be too delighted, and even for those people who wrote into you who has a child that's difficult, if I can be of any help to those people, help them understand, do a little bit of work with them, I have no problem with that. But children today, Fran, need a deeper connection, a deeper understanding, because, as I said, because of the developmental side of things. And the other side of it is this: adults are in the same boat. Don't think because we're an adult that we don't need that emotional need of connection. So people tonight at home, leave the phones down, turn off the TV, sit down, as I said, pull out a Lego game or pull out something, and just communicate and get to know each other and connect, like you said. Otherwise, I'll tell you what, I don't know how CAMs are not going to cope. There's a year's waiting list. Yeah, parents are not coping, so we need a shift in direction.
One of a lot of stuff in on this, but one of them jumps out at me. It says, "I have a 17-year-old boy full of aggression. When I ask him to come off PlayStation or the phone, I just don't know what to do." Your
child is frustrated.
Yeah,
that's not aggression. The child is frustrated, and you can't just take these things off these children, because that's a discipline. Again, it goes back to, and I would bet you go back along through because behavior is learned. And we learn to cope with our stresses. So the brain wires itself, Fran. So if this young guy who's on these games continuously, and this is how he deals with his stress, this is how he has disconnected, this is how he has opted out. Do you get what I'm saying? He has opted out of society because society doesn't fulfill his needs.
It's amazing, isn't it? Michael, it's always a pleasure, and thanks for coming into studio.
Not at all. Thank you.
Really good to see you. That's bioenergy healer Michael O'Doherty speaking to us today.